Welcome, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and hand over this session to our speaker, Jeff Marion. He is a retired adjunct professor with Virginia Tech University. I had the wonderful pleasure of studying under him a little bit in one of my summers in grad school, so I'm really excited to introduce him to all of you today. He is going to talk about the recreation ecology of managing sustainable trails. So really lucky to learn from him today. So thank you, Jeff, for being here.
Very good. Thank you so much, Caitlin. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. Caitlin may have mentioned I retired just last July. I'm still actively writing, working on three different books, including a revision of the Leave No Trace book. The first one is almost done. It's on monitoring and visitor use management kinds of topics. That will be published. All of them, except for the L&T book, will be published as open source free books on the internet. So be looking for those. I'm happy to be here today to share with you some of what we've learned in recreation ecology, which is a very small field of study that studies visitor impacts to protected natural areas, including wilderness, backcountry, and parks and forests. About sustainable trails, which has become a big passion for me. I've backpacked the entire Appalachian Trail. I'm currently working on the Pacific Crest Trail. I've got a 300-mile High Sierras hike set up for this summer. I just got back from a big canyoneering trip in Utah. So I'm still very active in the outdoors, exercise a lot, and continue to enjoy the great outdoors, and hopefully I'll meet with some of you at some point in the future. So let me go ahead and get started. The focus on this talk today is on sustainable trails, and I'm going to cover it from somewhat broader perspective, sort of 3 points. First, the sort of the design of these trails. How do we design, and what does recreation ecology and trail science, research have to say about that? The second is in the management area of, how do we examine the legacy trails that we already have and evaluate those? How do we, decide which ones we need to relocate and improve? And then how do we actually manage the trails themselves in terms of maintenance kinds of actions predominantly? I will not be able to today talk about sort of visitor use management. I wish I had time for that, but I just had to cut somewhere. And so the visitor use management, including Leave No Trace, is out of this presentation. I will be talking tomorrow about the science behind Leave No Trace. I was a founding board member of Leave No Trace, and I chaired the committee that developed and refined a lot of those practices back in the 90s and early 2000s. And so I'll be sharing some of the science behind those practices tomorrow. All right, so let me go ahead and get started. Oh, by the way, I'm located in Blacksburg, Virginia. Used to work at Virginia Tech, although my employer was the U.S. Geological Survey, and before that was the National Park Service. Okay, so I've sort of covered this. I'm going to talk about this recreation ecology, trail impact research, and the implications for sustainable trail design and management. And I've got some pictures, if you've been looking at those, showing you some really bad examples of non-sustainable trails and then some very highly sustainable side hill trails. And you'll know a great deal about that at the end of this presentation. So the objective kind of really for most protected areas that have this dual legal mandate to preserve natural conditions and processes and such, and make them available and facilitate and manage recreational visitation to those same places. That dual mandate is made much easier when you try to focus on sustainability. And so that's really what this entire talk is focused on. I defined in the literature a sustainable trail can accommodate the intended type and amount of use over time without unacceptable levels of degradation or maintenance. That's kind of the gist of what we're at here. And there's always this big management toolbox, and it can include things like site management actions where you design and construct and maintain sustainable trails. It can contain various kinds of regulatory features, like trailhead quotas and things, prohibiting horse use on certain trails, for example, managing mountain biking use. And then it can include the whole realm of sort of leave no trace or low impact educational kinds of tools. Again, we won't be able to get to those today. Um, so let's very briefly kind of run through, what are we talking about when we say impacts from trails? These are, obviously human use related impacts that humans may be on mountain bikes or horses, or in other cases, motorized use. I won't really talk about that today, but it's still human impacts to protected areas. And there are really three core, there's sort of a fourth, but three core kinds of impacts here. The first is the widening of the trail. The second is muddiness, which is generally a pretty rare form of impact. And the third, and I would argue most serious, is soil loss. That fourth category is vegetation damage and degradation, and in particular the introduction and dispersal of non-native and exotic vegetation. We'll talk about that briefly. But I'm probably going to focus most today on soil loss. I'll make the argument here in a minute that I think it's the most egregious form and the most ecologically and managerially salient form of trail impact. It's the one that we really need to focus our greatest attention to. And in our program of research in recreation ecology and trail science, we've been focusing on it for years, decades, really. And you see here three examples of fairly significant, I would argue, unacceptable soil loss. And where does that soil go when it comes off our trails? Well, unfortunately, some of it, it makes it down to streams and waterways where it can have secondary impacts to aquatic macroinvertebrates and fishes and so on and so forth, the fauna that live in streams. And in this case, at Big South Fork National River and Recreation Area in Tennessee and Kentucky, we had some big problems with federally listed rare and endangered mussel or shellfish species. That these were soil sedimentation impacts largely from very heavy and intensive horse use. And as you can see in this picture, it happens across the world. This is from Maui, Haleakala National Park. We did a study in both front country and back country. And what you're looking at here is a horse trail that goes down into the crater at Haleakala Volcanic Park. And it's called the Sliding Sands Trail, aptly named. It's this sort of unique sort of clastic soil type that you have in volcanic areas, and it just kind of moves. It's very dynamic soil. And from decades and decades of intensive horse use, as you can see, they've lost a lot of soil. So we measure these kinds of impacts to trails, and then we perform various kinds of analytical analyses. I'll get to that here in an upcoming slide. But one of the things we measure that's very clearly illustrated here is cross-sectional area soil loss. So if you're looking at it from a side angle, how much soil has been lost from this location because of its use, development and use as a trail. And you get into different kinds of debates, and I'm not going to get into that today, but based on the original land surface or the current tread boundaries or whatever. In many cases, trails have been constructed with side hill construction where you literally dig and fill soil from uphill to downhill to create a slightly outsloped bench, for people to walk on. We don't normally count the trail construction impact as impact. We can measure it, but we often focus on what's between the tread boundaries, and that's where it gets complex. Okay, so with that as kind of a quick background, we're going to look a little more detail in some of these, some of our results, and trail widening is the first one, really. I make the argument here that a trail that's twice as wide is essentially, creating a footprint of intensive trail impact that's literally twice what it needs to be. So if the AT is, supposed to be 18 inches and it's 36 inches, well, you've just, impacted another 400 acres. And, that 400 acres, I would argue, falls into the avoidable impact category. So, if we're going to have use, we got to manage the use. We got to accept some footprint of impact. It ought to be the minimally acceptable, small size of impact that we can possibly manage, like an 18-inch tread for hikers. And anything above that, I sort of, in my mind, I look at it pretty black and white. That's avoidable impact. It's low-hanging fruit. We ought to avoid it. So give that some thought. Okay, muddiness, again, I said that this is reasonably rare in most cases, just a few isolated places, unless, of course, you happen to be hiking the Appalachian Trail through Vermont, which many of the through hikers call Vermud, the Vermud state. I hiked through Vermont and it was Vermud. I was wringing water out of my socks the second night I got into I have a Hennessy hammock that I use to sleep in. I do pristine sort of natural site camping away from shelters and campsites and things. And I was literally wringing water out of my socks, even though I had double waterproofed my shoes before I started that hike. At any rate, this particular impact creates other kinds of impacts like trail widening and sort of aneurysms of informal trails that radiate around the mud holes. People don't like to get their feet wet, so they kind of go around these things. And so the impact actually grows larger than the mud hole. Non-native vegetation, this is really the only slide I've included on this topic, but we've written a whole paper and you'll notice that there are paper links throughout this. Hopefully there's going to be a way for you guys to get this presentation or access it on the internet. I've put it up in a folder. If you can't find it, just email me. And you can easily find my email. It's jmarion@vt.edu, but you can easily search it out on the internet. At any rate, these non-native plants are introduced and dispersed and distributed throughout protected natural areas by visitors and the animals and whatnot that they come with, including dogs or horses or pack mules. And managers are increasingly concerned about this. We're getting non-native plants in a lot of different places these days, and people that, even beyond the formal trail system, they're creating informal trails, visitor-created informal trails. And these species can be arrayed along all of those. And this particular species, Japanese stillgrass, Microstegium, it's all over my neighborhood trail system now. It just showed up about 15 years ago. It's all over the AT in certain places. It's in many different eastern protected natural areas. And it has a unique invasive quality that it can actually move away from the disturbance corridor of a trail and outcompete native vegetation in essentially undisturbed settings. So it's one of the scary invasive types that we are really concerned about. So we have this management toolbox, which I constantly refer to, and we're going to kind of go through that in sort of some broad categories. And so the first topic here I have is recognize and assess the sustainability of legacy trails. And so you might ask, well, what's a legacy trail? Every protected natural area that I've ever worked in, when I start asking the managers and the most knowledgeable visitors in those areas, they say, well, the trail network in this park, forest, BLM area, name your unit. Some of them are old, this type of route. Some of them are old, this type of route. And I've got a list down here, firefighting kinds of roads and stuff, old logging and mining roads, old roads up to, home sites and resorts and things. Those things are often gone now, homesteads and such. And even the native people had trail systems, and some of those are literally still in our parks and old logging roads and things, narrow gauge logging. If you're in Shenandoah or Great Smoky Mountains National Park, for example, there's a lot of those. Those are some of the most sustainable routes, but generally, and by a large to a very, very large extent, these legacy routes were created so long ago that they were created by people who had, essentially no knowledge of sustainable trail design. And yet we go to our parks today and we see these alignments in all of the current trail systems, and it presents a lot of problems. These limitations, these flat grades, they can become muddy. They generally incise down into the landscape, and then they start collecting water, particularly during rainy periods. But even not during rainy periods, if they get deep enough, they sort of become incised enough that people don't want to walk in a trench, and so they move over very commonly. And then a lot of these routes also are just insanely steep. And so you see this picture on the right. I took that when I was hiking the AT. I did most of the AT hiking by myself solo, and I came to this and kind of woke up and said, "Oh wow, look, a rope." It's It's an old rock climbing rope. I'm a climber, and so I recognize that. And it goes straight up a really, really steep slope. And there was literally a aluminum ladder up a cliff about, I don't know, that same day. This is in New Hampshire, just north of Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. I have a brother that lives there. And so, these sort of fall line alignments, really bad, the least possible sustainable alignment you can have is straight up the fall line. The fall line is if you dump a bucket of water on a slope, it goes straight down the fall line, okay? That's the definition of fall line. And you can see that in the picture on the right, the AT folks, Morgan Somerville in particular, rerouted that trail and took it off the fall line and did restoration work and they even graveled it. A lot of these existing trails in formal parks and formal trail systems and forest, and BLM and Fish and Wildlife System, they were originally visitor created, and visitors are probably the world's worst trail designers. Pardon, I mean, we're all visitors, but they pretty much look at a destination and say, I'm going to go straight there. Rock climbers in particular, and I'm kind of an old rock climber, are the worst of the worst. They literally go straight there. They don't care how steep it is. And so they create these nightmarish trail alignments, and then for some reason we seem to include them in our trail systems. And so the very, very first thing that I really want to stress, particularly to you young people, is you're going to be moving around from PA to PA, hopefully your whole career. And you should always be very skeptical when you arrive in a new place that the existing set of trails that they call their formal trail system is necessarily the best and only set of trails and segments. We really do need to, do some GIS analyses, and maybe invite in some trail professionals and ask the very tough question, which of these need to be relocated or just flat out closed, and then, fixed. A lot of folks look at that and say, "Oh my gosh, it's an enormous task. It will take forever, and we don't have that kind of staff and money." My answer to that is fine. Just do, one little segment a year or even every 2 years, but start the process. Don't ignore it, which I think too often happens. And so, some questions here that can kind of guide some of that. But we're going to be learning a lot more today about, okay, well, how do we do that? What is sustainable? How do we assess sustainability? And I'll be answering those questions here in a minute. So now we're kind of into the second grouping of topics for the toolbox, which is to design and construct sustainable trails and relocations. Before we get there, we need to understand, well, what is a sustainable trail? And so that's where the science comes in. A lot of trail knowledge, if you pick up, and I've got probably 15 books on my shelves that were written by trail practitioners. These are professional trail designers and people who construct trails for a living. None of them have had a degree in sustainable trail design. That degree doesn't exist in the United States. It doesn't exist anywhere in the world. And most of them have learned by doing. It's called experiential education, trial and error. I'm not sort of dissing on their knowledge. In fact, I embrace their knowledge as a different and very valuable input into what is a sustainably designed trail. I am suggesting that we really do need to do a little more trail science and combine the scientific knowledge with the expert knowledge. And I believe very, very strongly that that's when magic happens. And so I am an advocate for doing that. So we're going to talk about the science side a little bit. And so we go out and we measure these things. We tend to do it at transects where we sort of randomly, or sort of a random stratification method of throwing transects out there. We measured 3,150 transects on the Appalachian Trail as part of it was 3 years of field work. It's kind of a 6-year study that is now done. But we did a 9% geographically representative sample of the entire AT, and we have this enormous database, and we've learned a great deal from it. And some of what I'm going to be presenting today comes from that, but some of it comes from a whole multitude of other studies. This particular table is from a big state of knowledge kind of trail sustainability journal paper that I wrote a few years ago. There's a link up here in the upper right. It's a little bit hidden, but you can find that paper there. And it reviews all of the trail science studies I could possibly lay my hands on, at least all the most relevant and best ones. And I looked at, what are the relationships that these studies have shown between various attributes like trail grade or landform grade or rugosity of the trail, the ruggedness or roughness of the trail, and various kinds of soil impacts, or trail impacts rather. And so that's just to show you that, that there are a lot of these trail science studies out there. It's not huge though. Recreation ecology and trail science in particular is an exceedingly small field of study. I mean, there's literally 3 people in the United States right now who would introduce themselves as recreation ecology scientists that focus in that area full time. Now that I'm retired, and my colleague or my mentor, David Cole, retired about 10 years ago. He and I authored a lot of the papers, but there's other, excellent folks out there still studying. I'm just, I'm out of the game now and trying to write everything I know into books. But there is a lot of good stuff out there. It's just that it's an insanely small group of people doing this type of research. And internationally, there's less than 10 people that would introduce themselves as a recreation ecology scientist. So it's a very small field of study. Okay, so what I decided to do here, I've got tons and tons of tables and graphs and stat tests and all that kind of stuff. There's no way I can present all that. And so I've just summarized some of the basic information on this slide. Trail grade, increase in soil loss with increasing trail grade. Trail slope alignment, and I'll have a slide on that here in just a minute, but it's the angle of the trail up the landform grade. Is it on the fall line straight up the slope? Is it on the contour line, which is 90 degrees opposite that on the contour, or somewhere in between? It's a 90-degree angle. And those, side hill trails are by far and away the most sustainable. You don't want to be on the fall line, you don't want to be on the contour line. Trail substrate, there's no question that the more rock you have in trail substrates, the better off you are. Much more durable trails that don't erode, that soil doesn't displace as easily. Tread drainage is very critical, particularly when you don't have a lot of rock in the tread. And so the number of those drainage features, the locations of them, the efficacy, how effective they are in a 3-inch rainstorm, all of that is very, very important. And then finally, amount of use, quite frankly, for at least for soil loss, the amount of use is a fairly weak variable. And so it kind of gets me a little upset when I go out and I see all these trailhead quotas on the Pacific Crest Trail, for example, in various places, particularly the Sierras, which is what I'll be hiking this summer. A lot of use restriction, and quite frankly, even for camping, that's really not the answer. Professional management is the answer, and selecting sustainable trail alignments and sustainable camping locations is far, 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 far more important. I've got other talks out there on the web that address camping, so you might go search those out. Um, all right, so influential factors. This is a pretty good diagram that kind of explains some of the terms. And so here's the trail up here, right? This bench, it's a side hill bench constructed trail. And you can see there's trail grade here, and you use a clinometer up here in the upper right-hand corner. That's something that every trail person should own. It tells you the grade of the trail, the grade of the landform, which is kind of the landform within which this trail is located or situated, right? And then this fall line is again 90 degrees opposite the contour line. It's straight up and down the slope. Contour line is straight on the side of the slope, where every point on the contour line is equidistant from the sea level, right? Okay, and that's trail alignment, trail slope alignment is kind of the angle in between. There's another thing which I haven't included here called slope ratio. You should look that up. I just don't have time to get into the finer points of the difference between TSA, trail slope alignment, and slope ratio, but a lot of people use slope ratio. I'll just say that. Okay, so here's two trails, both the AT, different states that are, both really steep and they're also fall line alignments. They're pretty darn close, right? We've seen the one on the right already. But these are just inherently unsustainably designed alignments. They should not exist in any protected area, in my opinion. Avoidable impact, let's just say that. Okay, so soil loss really, and this is true, exponentially increases with increasing trail grade, particularly at the upper end, obviously. And you can see that in this figure where I have included one of the graphs from one of our papers and reports. This is maximum incision. So if you do a transect across a trail, and you measure from a transect line situated where the trail you feel is located at the post-construction pre-use tread surface. We have to estimate that, but we're very good at it. And then from that line down to the deepest part of the tread, that's called maximum incision. It's a quick and dirty measure of soil loss. Cross-sectional area where you're computing the volume of soil loss under that line, from that line down to the tread surface, is obviously much better, but way more complicated and time consuming. All right, so trail grade is kind of a duh. Most people know this, that steep trails are going to erode more than trails that aren't steep. Kind of a duh. The Forest Service has developed some excellent guidance, on trail grade. And here's some of their guidance. You can look at it. But they essentially say that above 15%, you really need to avoid that unless you either A, have a lot of steps in your trail. They could be wooden or rock steps, or you've got the entire tread surface armored with rock. So it's not going anywhere. It's not displacing. It's not eroding. We've not found any research behind this guidance, amazingly enough, and no one's ever given me $100,000 to produce it. And so it literally still doesn't exist. I find that a little amazing, quite frankly, that we don't have any guidance for how frequently to space water diversion features along our trails, and we're going to get into those in a little bit too at the end. So this trail slope alignment angle, trail grade is kind of a duh. Trail slope alignment angle, not quite so much. I've read these books written by these practitioners, these trail experts, and they have entire chapters on trail grade, and then they have usually about a paragraph, and sometimes it's a sentence or two, and it's hidden, very carefully hidden, where they talk about, oh, by the way, don't go up the fall line. That's literally the extent of what they say in some places. I'm here to tell you today, and this is another major finding, that in our analytical work in many, many different protected areas with many, many different trails with incredibly large data sets like the AT data set, that TSA, this alignment angle of the trail to the prevailing landform grade, is nearly as important and significant as trail grade. And yet, when we look at the books, that is not at all the case, walked away by readers of those books. One of my books that I'm going to work on, hopefully in a year or two, is going to be a sustainable trail design book, and it will be loud and clear there. But we do have many journal articles already, and there have been some links in this presentation to those papers. At any rate, let's look at this a little carefully because it's kind of important. So low alignment angle trails like here, these are, unsustainable. They're real close to the fall line. They easily widen because people that encounter, eroded rocks and roots and trenches and things, what do? They move laterally. There's nothing to stop them from moving laterally because both sides of the trail are just slightly higher than the tread itself, which is incised and probably becoming way more incised with time. Because what does water do when it hits the slope? It runs right down the trail. And unless you can defy the laws of physics, you can't get the water out of that incised tread on a fall line trail. Think about it. You can't do it short of a pump. And I've never seen anyone put a pump on a trail. So this trail on the right side here, this is from Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and the snow makes it look really cool. This is a slightly outsloped bench. And so water coming down this slope is going to hit the trail, and it's slightly sloped downwards to the low side so that water is going to travel across this trail and keep going down slope. That's called hydrologically invisible. That's what we want our trails to be. Now, we always build them that way, but within a year or two, they always concave. They always incise a little bit, whether it's from just simply compaction of soils after you build it. Some trail makers will literally go out with compacting devices, mechanical compactors, and compact that soil. Doesn't make a difference. Within a year or two, it's going to be a little bit concave. It's going to then accept that water and run it down the trail. It's inevitable. Even a well-designed trail is going to do that, unless I mentioned earlier, you have a lot of rock in that tread surface. And so you can build a sustainably designed side hill trail, but you also have to maintain it forever. More on that later. But this is the sustainable trail on the right. And obviously this is again, it's a 0 to 90 degrees, 0 bad, 90 degrees also bad. Why? Well, if you have a perfectly contour lined trail, water is going to come down the slope and sit on your contoured trail, and it's become a mud hole on a side hill trail, which you can't now avoid. You can go off trail uphill or off trail downhill, but you literally can't avoid it very easily. These fall line trails, quite frankly, are even way worse than a contour line trail because they become creeks. And so here's, one day I'm out hiking the AT by myself and I sort of wake up and, oh, I should take a picture of this. It looks like an Appalachian Creek instead of the Appalachian Trail. But that is the AT. And then on the right side here it is, well, this is in Connecticut, I guess. But at any rate, you can see what it looks like after the rain. We've done studies. Here's another diagram. You can see that with these fall aligned, this is trail slope alignment angle on this line here. So these are all fall aligned points from our hundreds and hundreds of sample points. This one down here is the best side hill aligned trail, okay? The lowest, 69 to 90 degrees. That's close to the contour line, right? That's the best. You can see that over here, which is CSA, cross-sectional area soil loss, this trail, all the points from all the trails on this line, which are close to the side hill, to the contour line rather, have very little soil loss. The ones on the fall line that are closest to the fall line have massive soil loss. And so that shows you the difference, even when you're accounting for the influence of trail grade, which is these here. Okay, so these are flat-ish trails. These are really steep trails. And now you're seeing the influence of trail grade as you go from here to here on any single line. But this figure shows better than anything I could possibly throw up that both soil or trail grade, which is from here to here on any of these lines, and trail slope alignment angle, which is from here, this line to this line, it suggests in this case that trail slope alignment angle is hugely important. And it is, but predominantly only for those trails that are really close to the contour, to the fall line. All right. So here's a graph. We created this for a journal article. It's a little fancier, but it kind of explains what we're talking about. 0 to 20 degrees, if it's that close to the fall line, it's really bad. Okay, very unsustainable. 69 to 90 degrees, it's close to the contour line now, is very good. You're not going to have much erosion on that. It's a highly sustainable design, unless you put it on the contour line, which is really, really bad. Mostly for muddiness, and trail widening, although it's on a side hill trail. Side hill trails can't widen very easily. So that's sort of a summary graph. And then we've taken those two indicators, which are multiple regression and relational analysis kinds of studies, statistical modeling, if you want to call it that. We've done all this modeling, and it's shown that trail grade and this TSA or slope ratio, if you want to use that, are the two most important, most influential factors. The third one would be how much rock is in the tread substrates. By far and away, the third one's that. We've had a hard time measuring that and showing its importance. I think it's just an inability to measure how much rock is in the tread substrates. It's not like we dig up the transects. But regardless, those three are probably the most important indicators or influential indicators. But with the top two, trail grade on this side, and here's three categories, and trail slope alignment, and here's the four categories. Again, this is fall line, really bad. This is side hill, really good. What it shows you is a matrix here with 4 by 4, 16 cells. The most interesting thing about this matrix is that there's only 3 cells, according to the way I interpret it, that are highly sustainable. In other words, this is where you want to be in the matrix, is only 3 cells. Why? Well, okay, let's look at grade for these 3 cells right here. 3 to 10%. That's excellent. You're not going to get amazing erosion occurring on trails that are only 3 to 10% grade. People like to hike trails up to about 10% grade. Above 10%, people start complaining. It's too dang steep. Okay. So those are both, from a resource protection and a visitor satisfaction, those are right in the right place for trail grade. How about trail slope alignment angle? Remember, I said this is the category that where everything goes, to heck in a handbag, basically. Is there anything close to the fall line? So this one always gets a penalty, this whole column. Okay. But these three are all side hill to varying degrees, but they're side hill. So those are the only three that are good. That's, sort of the good category. The neutral is this line right here. Why? Well, that's flat terrain. What happens in flat terrain? You get incised trails, the incised trails collect water, people go around. It's flat terrain, they can easily go around. So you get trail widening, you get trail muddiness. Those two problems can be rampant in flat terrain if you also have soils that are either seasonally or permanently wet or damp. Okay. So that's why that's sort of neutral. You could say that it's marginally bad. We ended up coming up with neutral, but I personally, it's really marginally bad. Okay, and then you get to poor, and again, there's this penalty for being in this column. So even though it's only 3 to 10, it's fall line 3 to 10. That's bad. And then these three are getting kind of steep, 11 to 20%. It's kind of steep, so that's bad. Okay, and then what's the worst of the worst? It's these 5 cells here. It's this one, again, penalty for fall line. And it's this entire row because, quite frankly, greater than 20%, that's a really unsustainably steep trail. Okay, so it's bad. So we can essentially apply this, and these percentages here that you see, this one, I don't even show it here, do I? I'm reasonably certain this is the Appalachian Trail. And so it's showing you that, in this very poor category, we've got 9.5%. It's showing you exactly where, every proportion of the AT is located in this 16 by 16, matrix of sustainability, right? And we can do this, and compare other parks and such. Here's a representation kind of blown up from a different study. We did a study at Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve, and we literally did all of this categorization using GIS. And I should say my doctoral students did this because I don't have those skill sets. But Dr. Jeremy Wimpy, Johanna Arredondo, and Fletcher Metama, they have those skills. Those are my sort of three doctoral students that have done the most of this kind of work. And so if you have a highly accurate trail layer, and if you have generally it's LiDAR derived digital elevation model data, and we're talking about sub-meter accuracy for both, okay, like really accurate data here. You put those two together, you can literally chunk your trails down into 10-foot pieces and then apply that TSA versus trail grade characterization or categories to your trails. In this case, we didn't use TSA, we used trail slope ratio instead. Again, I don't want to confuse things, but if you're interested in that, we did it in this study and we ended up with 6 different ratings of sustainability because we had such insanely good data. And you can see that, these sections of trail that are going straight across, I mean, these are contour lines. This is nearly at right angles to the contour lines, and you can see a fair amount of red, okay? Wherever it's going straight across at right angles of contour lines, that's a fall line alignment. And then you see places where it's really side hill trail, where it's crossing these contour lines at a really skewed small angle. It's mostly green. All right, and that's how it works. And so you can apply this to any place. Let me jump up to this figure and I'll go back. Here we've done different study areas. Here's the Appalachian Trail, and we've used these ratings to sort of compare and contrast. How sustainable is the AT compared to Big South Fork? Well, Big South Fork, 46% of their trails are in the good category, only 29% for the AT. 21% is in the very poor for the AT. That's pretty bad. Most of these trails are up in the New England states, where the glaciers kind of took all their soil. And so they can run trails straight up and down mountains on the fall line and not lose hardly any soil. Why? Because the glaciers took all the soil. So they typically have like, 2, 3 inches of soil, a thin veneer of vegetation on that soil, and then rock. And so when you run it straight up the fall line, it really just serves to make the trail challenging for visitors, and in some cases dangerous. But there's not a big resource impact penalty, so to speak. All right, so let me go back and just show you again visually what we're talking about here. So flat terrain, remember I said there's kind of a small penalty for flat terrain. There's a flat terrain trail. It's got water in the bottom of this incised thing. Here's one of the trails I mentioned from Vermont. You can see Vermud. It's a contour line side hill trail, and it's full of water. And this was not immediately after a rain either. This was like a week after a rain. Here's a picture from Zion National Park showing a roughly fall-lined trail that they've put in steps, and all they've done is you've got erosion, deposition, erosion, deposition. It's not a cure-all to this problem. You haven't solved the problem. This trail is getting deeper over time. It really does need to be closed and relocated. And then here finally is my sort of perfection, the most beautiful sort of side hill trail with a nice gravelly kind of tread, very, very, very sustainable in all different attributes. Not too steep. It's probably not ever going to erode, really. You could put a ton of use on this. It's hydrologically invisible. You just can't say enough good things about this trail. This is the PCT. Okay, so moving on. We're in the last category now of our toolbox, create durable treads and drainage features. I've got a lot of pictures here, but I'm going to go relatively fast. Mostly, I just want to illustrate a bunch of different things. I'm going to start with kind of a summary slide of best management practices that pertain to this particular topic. The first is use only side hill and no fall line alignments. I stick to that. I think a trail professional will tell you the exact same thing, but I'm telling you the research makes it even more clear in black and white. Just avoid anything close to the fall line. Even a really talented trail maintainer has real challenges, like pull my hair out kind of challenges and frustrations with maintaining anything that's close to the fall line. And so that's just, I'm putting that right at the top. You're going to have some places in your trail system that are steep in most cases. If you got a mountainous park or a big valley park, you're going to have some steep parts. The question is how many and how steep are they? Certainly anything over 20% or 30% ought to be examined very carefully. If it's not almost solid rock, it's going to erode badly. And again, like I said, up in the New England states, you got stuff that's 30% grade, but all of the soil has been lost from that alignment like, 50 years ago. You're on rock. And so, then the question just becomes, are we making a trail or retaining a trail which is displacing the old, the unfit, and the young? And I suggest to you that today in America, that probably encompasses at least 70% of our population. If you're okay with excluding and displacing 70% of your population from your trail, then by all means have a 30% fall aligned trail that's on rock. I was on the board of directors for the American Hiking Society for 8 years, and even though I'm a rock climber and I don't mind those kinds of trails, and I'm fit enough to hike them, I still question whether we should have those kinds of trails in our national parks. In some cases, they're dangerous. I could tell you stories about that too, like the woman I saw with the huge, broken arm with a cast on it, hiking in Maine to Katahdin, a through hiker. And she broke her arm, on a really, really steep section that was nasty rock. At any rate, so these need to be limited in number and location. And if you can relocate them, fine. But again, that's sort of just, again, advice. Flat terrain, avoid it whenever possible. Now, a lot of parks are lots of flat terrain, so you're not going to completely avoid flat terrain, obviously. That's kind of crazy. But when possible, shift your trails out of flat terrain to any side hill slopes that are available anywhere and design the entire trail that way. And if you do it in GIS, it's quite easy to do that. Construct and maintain a sufficient density of effective and sustainable tread drainage features. Okay, and we're going to see all of these in a little bit here. Grade reversals are way preferred over tread outsloping, which doesn't last, as I mentioned earlier, or water bars, which is kind of the old school traditional method of getting water off of trails. And we'll see all of that here coming up in a little bit. Okay, so begin. Select durable treads. What's a durable tread? Well, as I said, it's one that has a lot of rock in the substrates. And so here's some pictures. I literally hiked the High Sierra Trail and about 140 miles on the Pacific Crest Trail this last year. And these are pictures from those hikes. And lots of rock in the treads. If you can avoid being in a lot of soil and be in a lot of rock, then do it by all means. And your trail will be way more sustainable. It will last far longer with far less maintenance work. And you can see that just by looking at these pictures. Here's a picture of what, if obviously sometimes you can't. You're in soil and there's hardly any rock in that soil and you got to go there. Well, that just means you need to have way less grade. You have to have way better tread drainage features, and you have to maintain those things unless you build them really sustainably, i.e. trail grade reversals, which again, we'll see in a minute. But when the trail gets deep enough, even when it's not filled with water during a storm, people will just simply move over. And you've all seen that, I'm sure, in your experience. Here's a similar trail angled up, it's a side hill trail, but it's in New England. It's in New Hampshire in particular, near Mount Washington. But here, this AT hiker with an insanely large pack is on rock. And this rock has literally been moved around a little bit to make a real tread. In some cases, they don't always do that. Here's a very intensively used horse trail from the Hoosier National Forest, and you can see how wide it is and how muddy it is. And here's the same trail elsewhere in the forest where they graveled a part of it. And you can see probably the same amount and type of use, but it now looks way better because they graveled it. It actually takes a pretty thick layer of gravel and crush and run generally. Um, okay, other kinds of durable treads. Here's one that's been graveled. It's actually in South America, and this is sort of a lava type rock, like from AHA substrates. This is the PCT, but you can see that even though spring snowmelt has hit this trail and unfortunately not been directed across the trail, it's going down the trail, bad. It's not going anywhere because it's all rock. And so what? Maybe, I don't know. I still tend to want to move the water across the trail instead of down it. Here we are in the Olympic National Peninsula and Park, and they've used a very, very rot resistant, sequoia wood for this trail. It will last a very long time. Otherwise, don't use wood. And then this is in North Cascades National Park, and I think this one is the AT, I'm not positive. But at any rate, you again seeing some really, really inspired, gifted trail work in these two. These were put in by people with just decades of experience of rock work and working with sustainably designed trails. Again, I don't doubt their expertise. In fact, I applaud it, and I wonder at it when I'm hiking. I'm just saying that, let's have a little trail science in there as well. We have learned a few things that I don't think they have, particularly this TSA stuff and the legacy trail stuff and some other things. Um, all right, tread armoring. This is kind of a big topic. We're going to get then into steps and drainage features. So more intensive, it's expensive, it's artificial. Trail folks just love to build this stuff, but it's insanely expensive and slow and tedious. It takes forever, but it does create really, really durable trails. However, you do still have very heavy use, which can ruin these things over time and freeze thaw action from, thousands of instances of where water has gotten in under those rocks and frozen and then thawed and frozen and then thawed. These things don't last forever. They can last a long time, but not forever. Using really large angular rocks that interlock is important to anchor those rocks really deep. That's really important. So there are ways to do this that they figured out. But in general, if you could easily reroute the trail and save all that money, why would you want to spend that kind of money to armor this thing? And particularly unless visitors really love it. And in many cases, you're armoring because it's so dang steep that visitors don't like it. In other words, visitors don't like walking up a 20% grade, even if it's armored in rock. Okay, it's not enjoyable. You're still going to displace the old, the unfit, and the young. And so should we really be doing this? So question yourself before you say, oh yeah, let's go armor that thing. We've got the rock available. It's real close. It's uphill from the trail. Let's go do it. I still rather see us reroute that and not need to do this expensive and very artificial kind of armoring, even though these folks love doing this stuff, and some of them do it exceptionally well. So there's flagstone paving, which is this. There's stone pitching, where the stones are turned on end and they go much, much deeper. This is obviously more durable. There's something called Appalachian armoring, which has been developed, where they use rot-resistant logs in there. This is probably because it has some logs in there, it's probably the less effective one, but at any rate, there's different kinds of armoring. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of that. It does work. It does work. It creates durable treads. People can ride and jog and run horses on them and so on and so forth. It is, it's a bit artificial. It's not sort of natural looking as compared to a regular tread. And some of it can be quite beautiful. This one here on the left and on the right is from Acadia National Park, and it was built by, basically third generation stonemasons from Europe during the Depression, funded by, the wealthy people in Bar Harbor way back in the, I don't know, 1930s roughly. But this is the only place that, I was hiking where my wife got really upset with me because she had to wait on me, which is normally not the case. But I was taking hundreds of pictures of this stuff. I just couldn't walk more than 50 feet without taking another picture. And she was waiting on me somewhat impatiently. This trail here is from Grand Canyon. It was built by people who are bringing ore out of the canyon way back in, again, like the 30s or 20s, or I don't know when, but way back, more than 100 years ago. And it's still there. It's still looking pretty good. I hiked that whole trail, and there's a lot of this stone pitching, except for the places where there were landslides that wiped it out entirely, completely gone. Here's some really inspired work in Yosemite National Park. These are girls from my venture crew. For 19 years, I've been a leader of a Boy Scout high adventure crew called Venture Crew, and my crew was started by my daughter, and it was predominantly female over all of that time. But prior to that, as a Boy Scout leader, Scoutmaster. But at any rate, you'll see pictures, quite a few with young women in them, and that's from my Venture Crew. But these are just incredible pictures. Oh, sorry, I went the wrong way. Pictures of that. Here's the High Sierra Trail again. These have been, big, big rocks moved around to make a good tread. Here's more pictures of the Venture Crew, again in Yosemite National Park. This is a high-use horse trail, and the horses really want this sort of sandy, loamy soil in the middle. It's softer on their feet rather than walking on solid rock. But visitors don't tend to want to hike in that. So you can see the girls here are hiking on the left side because I don't know, if you're not wearing gaiters, you get sand in your shoes. Here's, using geotextiles. These are really heavy duty concrete blocks that fit together like a puzzle, as you can see. Makes a really durable trail. It's, kind of artificial looking, but it works. Here's something that doesn't really work, and that's the geotextile GeoWeb, where they fill this with crush and run gravel. And my experience is it works really well in flat terrain and sometimes in flat, muddy terrain. But it does not work well on hills. On hills, this gravel is going to just simply slide downhill. It's going to be dislodged, displaced downhill, and it's all going to end up at the bottom, probably in the creek. Stone steps is another category I'm going to cover very quickly. They can be very effective in preventing erosion and shoring up the soil of your trail. Again, really inspired work by the folks who constructed this in I'm trying to think. This is Olympic National Park again. And again, I've taken a lot of photos because it's just gorgeous work. And so more stuff you can appreciate. I just love having, amazing pictures of highly sustainable trails. But there can be problems. Whenever you put steps into something, people tend to go around them. And so here's some stone steps in a kind of a low, wet area, and people don't like walking on that stuff because it's not real smooth. So they go around it. And then here's a water bar, which is probably very effective, but they're going around it. And so one of the things that is sort of a given here is that, when you have this, you really need to think about trying to make the tread be the best, most appealing route when you do this kind of work. The tread wants to be the most appealing route. Off-trail areas must be far less appealing, and this is really quite important. And otherwise, visitors will go to the most appealing route. And so when you put in a huge, I call this a Paul Bunyan step right here, this really tall step in the upper middle. People are going to go around that unless you put in a sort of smaller step. And I think I have pictures of that coming up in a minute. Here's some big stone staircases on Whitney. We went up over and down Whitney on this last trip. And we had lots and lots of Paul Bunyan steps, which again, I don't mind, but other people really, really do mind them. And here's Morgan coming down a Paul Bunyan step. It's like 1.5 feet or 2 feet tall. And they have put an intermediate step here on the trail side. You see one right here as well. And people use them. If you sit and watch people, they use those things. Some trails are in such steep terrain that you got to consider building stone walls. Here's just a couple pictures that show you the kind of stone walls that are necessary. And again, they have to be built really solid because these trails are going to be subject to literally avalanches of snow almost every winter. And so if you don't build them exceptionally well, you're going to be rebuilding them every year. You kind of have to do that anyways. But in steep terrain, beware that you're not building for use. You're building for massive amounts of snow during avalanches, and it needs to handle that as well. In some cases, you're in such high country with just exposed bedrock everywhere that you've got a blast to create a trail. And you can see here where they drill down. This is the High Sierra Trail. It goes from Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park to the top of Whitney. And you can see where they drilled down. This is literally back in the 1930s, I believe, that they created this route. And just an amazing feat given the lack of technology that they had, back then, I should just say primitive. I mean, they had drills, obviously, but just way more challenging than today. And then finally, switchbacks. Very quickly, it's best to not include switchbacks because people are apt to cut them. particularly young males in my experience, but others as well. And so just try to minimize their use. It's much better to have a sort of a side hill trail that just winds around the mountain or around the ridge and doesn't do a stacked set of switchbacks. But sometimes it's unavoidable. Avoid muddiness and excessive trail widening by avoiding flat terrain. Again, I've said this a few times. Here's my crew trying to measure probably the worst transect of those 3,150 for muddiness on the lower right here. The upper one here is my adventure crew in the Wind River Range, Wyoming. Here's a trail that this hiker is not using. Why is this hiker not using? Well, it looks like a creek. Again, it's a trail in flat terrain. It's during snowmelt. And here's what they've done. Again, High Sierra Trail, they've elevated the trail. Excellent, superb trail right here. And sometimes when you're in flat terrain, you can't avoid it and you want to control widening and such. You can use rocks like this. And I prefer rocks, not logs, because rocks can be spaced apart a little bit so that the water will drain off the trail. As long as the trail is sufficiently elevated above the surrounding land. And when you don't have rocks, you have to use wood. And so when you have trees that fall across the trail, cut out a fairly narrow gap in those trees, and that self-centers the traffic, keeps the trail narrow. You can bring wood in and stick it into the trail corridor a little bit, like here and here and here and here and here and here. And that will help to narrow the trail. It will also help to tell people which of the multiple parallel routes is the trail and which one is not the trail. Like here, you can see two and maybe even three parallel routes. Very common in meadows, and meadows can look, I mean, look at this meadow. Before that work was done, it was a real eyesore. And we really want our meadows to look pristine. And so staying on top of this and being proactive is pretty important. Better yet, just avoid the meadow and put the trail in the woods, or better yet, keep the trail out of flat terrain. Keep it on a side hill somewhere. Side hill trails just can't widen, and you can't have multiple treads generally. All right, so one of our last topics here is tread drainage, water bars. How are we doing? Not bad. So water bars can remove water from a trail, but they are, kind of unsustainable. People often build them at too much of a right angle, so the water comes down the trail, hits this and slows down, drops its sediment right in your trench, and then it seeps off. This needs to be angled, okay, so that the water hits this thing, runs off fairly fast and drops its sediment down below the trail down here in the woods where it gets filtered by veg and organic litter. And so here's, kind of a step over for something that's seasonally wet, like during snowmelt. And here's another sort of step water bar-ish kind of a thing. But in every case, these things need to be cleaned out and managed and whatnot to keep them efficient. A much, much more efficient and much more sustainable method of draining trails is to have a reversal in grade of the main tread. And so this trail goes uphill, goes downhill, and goes uphill again. And so this trail is generally trending uphill here, but it has this break where temporarily for 10 feet or so, it goes downhill. And any water coming down this trail is going to have to go off here because this trail goes uphill right here for a very short 10, 12, 15 feet. And this is something that you don't have to clean. It can't be clogged up. If this thing in here is about 1.5 feet higher than that low point, it's going to take one heck of a lot of deposition to ever ruin that. It's not a small feature, in other words, it's a huge feature. And so it requires little to no maintenance forever. And so it's way better than water bars and some of the other kinds of tread drainage features. And so all new trails ought to have this, and they can be installed on existing trails. It can be challenging. It takes someone with talent and time to do it, but quite frankly, it's well worth it if you can have that done. Here's another example. It's really hard to show this. I use all these little arrows to kind of show what I mean by grade reversal. Here's this actually is higher, okay, than this. This is much higher than this, but you can't hardly see that. It's really hard to take a picture. But bottom line, this is a grade reversal with a trench. But that trench could become filled with soil and need to be maintained. So this is not as good as this, except for the fact that it has a lot of rock. Rolling grade dips is another name for a trail grade reversal. It tends to mean, most people tend to mean it to be a larger feature in the landscape, like 10 to 20 feet and 30 feet long and such. But these diagrams sort of show you what that looks like. Once again, they really don't have to be maintained ever. And so they're very permanent and effective forever, and therefore very sustainable. Mountain bikers love them, obviously, because there's no water bar with a rock or a wood impairment to your forward progress. People sometimes hit those and go off their bike. It can be rather dangerous, result in a lot of injuries, maybe a lawsuit even. And then stream crossings, another topic here. I showed this before, but this is that Big South Fork with the federally listed mussel species. And bridges obviously are, they work, but they're very pricey. And then you got to maintain them forever. And by Lord, if you don't design them well and if you don't maintain them well, then you're liable. If a pack train goes over and the bridge falls in, someone gets hurt, you're going to get sued and they're going to win. Okay. And so we prefer not to see bridges unless we really need them for safety. Not putting one in and having someone try to wade across a snow melt filled raging torrent and dying is equally bad. And so bridges are absolutely necessary sometimes. People die literally every year on the PCT during the snowmelt season, trying to get across, raging torrents. Wait till early morning. That's when they're not raging. You just camp and wait. Culverts, and small things, small kinds of streams can be used. They have to be really huge. We're discovering because of climate change and these increasing, what used to be a 2-inch rainstorm, thunderstorm event is now like a 5-inch rainstorm, thunderstorm event. And we're losing trail these days, and particularly culverts that are not big enough, and so they really need to be oversized. Low water crossings is kind of a way, but again, during snowmelt, it's a real problem. But using really large, durable rock that will withstand flooding, you're not going to have to go out and rebuild a bridge every 5 years or 10 years. Stream fords, again, hardened treads and things. Let's just look at a few pictures. So, this works unless it's during snowmelt, in which case this may not work unless some of these rocks are really high above the flow and close together, which, you can't jump from this one to that one probably with a raging torrent in between. In some cases, we're now trying to put really big rocks like this very close together, so even during snowmelt, people can get across some of these streams. It involves using, chains and come-alongs and all kinds of stuff to maneuver these big rocks into the right place. But I suggest we need to be doing more of that because of climate change. Here's an enormous log that was put across this creek. I don't know if it was natural or felled, but it's probably not going anywhere. Although, in a big, huge flood, it probably will go somewhere. Here's a formal bridge. But again, like I said, this, has to be maintained and it has to be engineered and so on and so forth. Here's something that sets up, this log could disappear, but you could replace the log that hopefully the stonework will stay put during flood events. This is in a low wetland area, and I don't know that this ever really floods per se, and so probably they can get away with this kind of tinker log effect here. Getting across a low wet spot with some rock work on both sides, you just step across it. Again, lots of different ways. This is an armored kind of bottom here that does flood occasionally, but they've got big rocks that are fit together like a puzzle. Same thing here. Mentioning here, my colleague Woody Keene, he used to be president of the Professional Trail Builder Association, which is the association that contains all of the most talented and expert trail designers and builders. And so, if you don't know about that organization, look it up online. All the best people are members of PTBA. But he gave me a bunch of these. Well, yeah, it gave me about seven or eight of the photos I've got in here, like this one here. And so, different ways to do this, quite a few different ways. Here's a Ford for sort of a Jeep trail. Again, works just fine. These work just fine during low water, but during a raging torrent, not so much. All right, and we're going to end with this picture. This is one of those things where you're kind of backpacking and you're practically not in your own body. You're daydreaming somewhere, and you suddenly wake up and say, "OMG, look at that!" It's a really, really talented set of stone steps that look like they just happened. Like most visitors would probably not even recognize this as a stone staircase. They would just think, "Oh, that's natural." And so from my perspective, that's perfection. When you have such a incredible job of workmanship with stone steps that it doesn't look artificial, that someone might not even recognize it, but it certainly woke me up from whether virtual world I was hiking in, and I took a picture of it. And I'll end with that.
One of the questions we received during your presentation was, would we want to be constructing those kinds of armored rock features in wilderness? And at what point does a trail feature start impacting wilderness character, in your
Yeah.
opinion?
Yeah, really good question. Well, and I've expressed some of that. Again, it's just my professional judgment, or to some extent, it's my personal judgment, really, is that I prefer not to see these sort of artificial looking stone staircases in backcountry or wilderness if they can be avoided easily. And yet I see them all the time in wilderness, outside of wilderness. And some of it, I guess I'm really attracted to seeing highly sustainable, highly skilled stonework. And so I stop and take pictures and I rave about them in presentations like this. But quite frankly, I agree. And that's kind of why I ended with the one I did here. This last picture shows, I think, an exceptionally talented person who created this. I have no idea who, but hats off because it looks really natural. And so, from a wilderness character perspective, it solves the resource protection dilemma and facilitates the recreation provision mandate and does it, where most visitors probably wouldn't even recognize it as a stone staircase. And so I do agree that these stone staircases, I would say that no, in some cases you don't really have a choice. You've got to use them, and the challenge is to make them as least artificial as possible. The only problem with that is that, if you put in big stone steps, people will go around them. And so you need a much larger sort of staircase with these nasty, gnarly rocks on both sides to keep people on the dang staircase. And so the feature becomes even bigger just because of human nature. Now, you could say, oh, well, we'll rely on leave no trace to keep them on the stone staircase. I'm an LNT fanatic, and I'm just going to tell you
Me too.
that's just idiocy. Because there will be 10% of people that will not, that you'll never reach, and that they will go around these things, and you'll have then way more impact. You'll have all this impact on both sides of the stone staircase because you didn't make the sides gnarly and nasty. So it's kind of a lose-lose situation. I'll just stop there.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate that
Yep.
answer. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, it fa- relocating fall line trails has a side effect where we have to get rid of the old trail.
Yep.
Have you researched that particular problem, how we get rid of it and
Yeah.
make it blend away? It's
Right.
it's difficult. It's not
Yeah.
non-trivial.
Well, actually, let me first mention I didn't cover this. Somehow I managed to miss it, even though I talked a mile a minute. The first thing is that in park after park after park, or forest after forest after forest, I go, and the ologists, the natural resource specialists, are all saying, leave the dang thing where it is. It's nasty, but let's just stone it up and deal with it and live with it, because they're told, or well, they figure out that in order to fix it, you close this, 1/10 mile fall aligned segment that's nasty and horribly unsustainable. And what are you going to replace it with? Well, in every case, you're replacing it with possibly, zero point 0.6 miles of less steeply graded trail. And so they do the cost benefit analysis and say, leave it where it is, and deal with it. And I understand where they're coming from, but I think that if they took and I always like to say this, a 200 plus or a 500 plus year time horizon, that they would always come down on the side of, let's make the darn thing more sustainable. That it won't be a nightmare for the rest of time. And when you leave a steep fall line trail, it's going to be a nightmare for the rest of time. And so first off, I think the answer is generally almost always, not always, but almost always, to get rid of the fall line alignments. Okay, how do you take care of them once you do? Well, first, visitors will use the new alignment because it's way easier and safer and more fun and less challenging, and you aren't displacing the old, the young, and the unfit, and so they will use it. They will largely not use the old steep fall line alignment because it's nasty. But you definitely want to make sure they don't use it. If you have to fence, temporarily fence it at both ends to keep them off of it, then so be it. So that the first thing is to keep all use off of it. The second thing is to then figure out, once you have all use off of it, you never want to do any restoration work until you've completely closed the alignment. Otherwise, people trample whatever plantings and soil and veg work you do. And so once you've closed it, you then, you can bring in some soil, possibly from an uphill location, borrow pits and things. Trail crews can do this. You can bring in veg specialists and have them revegetate it. There's lots of plants that like growing on rock and thin soil. And just organic litter, putting that in there, it will renaturalize over time. But it is an expensive proposition. Quite frankly, the most expense is in building the new side hill alignment, which is way, way longer in total length than the short, steep fall line piece that you've closed.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jeff.
It's been my pleasure. I wish you all the best of luck, and do email me. I'm retired. I got time. I'll send you more articles than you probably want to read.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, Jeff. We really appreciate you.